And with that, we will go ahead and get started. So the real basis for why we are having this conversation in the first place is that there is a huge housing need in our community right now. And you hear that in terms of a housing affordability crisis, but it's really a crisis that's being felt across a lot of different income levels and price points. And we know that because 40% of Tacoma households right now are quote unquote cost burdened, which means that they spend more than 30% of their income on housing costs. And generally that means more than 40 to 50% of their income on housing and transportation. This is especially concerning because housing costs are continuing to rise faster than incomes are. And we see that the impacts of that are that low and moderate incomes are being most impacted by this housing crunch. And so on the right side of your screen, what you'll see is an analysis of how many affordable and available units there are at different income levels. And if you think about this like musical chairs, those colored in houses represent the chairs that are available, whereas those gray houses there represent all of the people that are not going to have a house once the music stops. And so when we talk about the people that are most impacted by housing supply and demand, I'll just point you to the left side of that diagram that shows that there are only 27 affordable and available units for every 100 extremely low income households. And those are folks that make about 30% or below of the area median income. And in dollars, that's usually people that are making less than $25,000 or $30,000 a year. There are only 45 affordable and available units for every 100 very low income households. That's 50% AMI. And again, there's only 87 affordable and available units for every 100 low income households. So that is, there's so much more that we could say about the housing crisis and what it looks like and the rising rents and rising mortgage prices. But really what we want you to know in this slide is that the housing crisis is here because there's a real big supply and demand crunch around housing need in our city. And we're going to talk more about different ways that we need to help think about how we can meet that need moving forward. So just to take a slightly deeper dive into the prices that I'm talking about, just in the past 5 years, we've seen that the median home value has increased by 44% here in Tacoma. And that is a really, really fast rate of rise. And while that seems like a good thing for homeowners, it means more and more people are also being kept out of the market. And it also means that current homeowners are going to struggle to find new homes because median owner income has only increased by 22% in that time. So even for homeowners, income is only rising at half of the rate as home values. Now, in the rental market, you see a similar phenomenon where the median rent has increased by 21% in the past 4 years, whereas renter income has only increased by 12%. So continuing to see a larger percentage of people's incomes needing to go towards housing in order to afford to live in Tacoma. Now, the economics or the finances are one side of the puzzle, but the other side of the puzzle is really around housing supply and where housing is available to different people. And one of the things that we need to keep in mind as we have this conversation is the very real and present impacts that systemic racism have had on housing and the shape that it's taken in our city. And just as a quick illustrator of that, on the left side of your screen, you'll see a map from the Federal Housing Authority that was made in 1937 that designated different neighborhoods with residential security grades based on a number of different factors, and this was called residential redlining. And one of the factors that it took into account was how many people of color lived in that particular neighborhood. And so unbeknownst to a lot of people, a lot of the designations that you see on that map on the left take into account, for example, that without the presence of people of color, there would be higher investment grades on those places and higher home values placed on those places. But they were explicitly downgraded because of the race of those owners. And so why that's so important to our discussion is, even though we've come a long way since 1937, what you see on the right is the Tacoma Equity Index of today. And that shows access to opportunity and outcomes. And you can see that there's a lot of pattern overlap between that left and right, that map. And so as we talk about what housing opportunity looks like in the city, it's really important to keep in mind that housing opportunity in this city does have racial patterns to it, and that those racial patterns were explicitly designed into the fabric of our city. And so we have an opportunity to look at that history and see how we can move forward in thinking about how to create more equitable housing opportunities moving into the future for the city of Tacoma. So I think that takes me into my last slide, which is to tell you about what the Home in Tacoma project is in very broad brushstrokes. And when we talk about the Affordable Housing Action Strategy, or AHAS, as you see on the screen, there are 4 objectives that we know we have to simultaneously address in order to really do a good job of addressing this housing crisis. And those 4, as you can see here, are to create more homes for more people, to keep housing affordable and in good repair that already exists, so preserving affordable housing, to help people stay in their homes and communities, so help people that are experiencing housing crises, and then finally to reduce barriers for people who often encounter them. And so when we talk about the Home in Tacoma project, and Elliot's going to take you through the details of what that means and looks like, it's really aimed at this first objective about how do we create more homes for more people and support housing supply, choice, and affordability in our city. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Elliot. Thank you, Elliot.
Thank you so much, Jacques. And I'm going to go ahead and start talking about the specifics of the Home in Tacoma project. So thanks so much, Jacques, for setting the issue up, for reminding everybody that the proposals that we're talking about here, they're in response to these long-term trends, these long-term housing needs, and also even some changing preferences in terms of the types of housing that people would select if they were available. So I'm going to go through some of the policy background of the Home in Tacoma project, and then I'll go through the specific proposals. Apologize if it gets a little wonky, but we want to try to give you the information today, try to answer all your questions, have this recording on the webpage so that people can refer to it over the coming weeks and really provide meaningful input into this process. So the goal of the Home in Tacoma project is to promote housing supply, affordability, and choice throughout our neighborhoods. But it's more than that. Tacoma has developed a real vision for our neighborhoods and for our city over many years, and with lots of community dialogue. And really, it's about accomplishing multiple goals through our housing development. We want great neighborhoods that a lot of people can live in, that are livable, sustainable, and prosperous. We know that growth is coming to the region, and we have the ability and the responsibility to plan for that and figure out how and where the growth would occur. We know that we need to prioritize equity, empowerment, and anti-racism, and that there is a real connection there with housing choices. We know we want safe, healthy housing. Walkability is a huge thing because transportation is a big household cost, but also because walkability means thriving neighborhoods, it's good for us, etc. And lastly, we love our neighborhoods and we want to protect and build on the things that are unique and special about them. So over the course of the past year, to meet these housing goals, the city, and led by our Citizen Planning Commission, our resident volunteers who advise the City Council about land use and planning, we have developed these package of recommendations, and we've done that with a lot of collaboration and a lot of engagement. You may have participated in the survey. There are some virtual housing cafes featuring Jacques and other guests, and lots of meetings at council and with neighborhood groups, the development community, everybody that has something to do with this. And some of the key themes are just that there really is interest in having more diverse choices in our housing than what is available through our current housing rules. But getting it right is super important to people. Design and scale are absolutely critical. That we need to make sure whatever we do, it's supported well with infrastructure and services. And also, we're talking about making changes that could lead to more growth or different types of housing growth. We need to really look carefully at unintended consequences, some of the concerns that people have mentioned through the survey and other places. So those are the themes that have informed these proposals. The Planning Commission is now asking for your input on a package of proposals. And those proposals do the following things. One, they enable missing middle housing, which I'll give you a little more information about in a moment here. But what missing middle refers to is a range of smaller, often attached housing types, such as duplexes, triplexes, et cetera, and to allow those throughout most of the neighborhoods of the city of Tacoma, whereas today, most of those neighborhoods are single family. The proposal also has area set aside for mid-scale multifamily housing in more walkable urban areas. So that's enable missing middle housing, but it's to update design standards so that that housing complements the neighborhood and fits with the neighborhood. So that's a big part of the proposals, but they also look at strengthening our affordable housing policies and toolkits, and then also some policy updates to strengthen our recognition of racism and the impacts of systemic racism, and to make sure that people are not being displaced by these actions, and actually to help the people who are already today being displaced as much as we can. So that's what's in the proposals. The main tools that we have as a city to control growth, they come down to our land use authority. And here you see a graphic that shows our current land use framework. The different colors mean residential, business, industry, parks, et cetera, the different colors of the map. So this is our primary tool for affecting what can be built where throughout the city. And this map here zooms in on the area that's currently set aside for single family. So shown in bright yellow on this map, it's a big area of our city. It's about 3/4 of all the land where you can build housing in the city, and that's currently set aside for single family. That's the bright yellow color. The brown color is areas that are currently low density multifamily. So those are the two areas that are involved in these proposals. And the basic recognition that the city would be making is that by setting aside this much land for one type of housing that's actually a certain cost and uses the land in a certain rate, it's one house per single family lot. And what it does is it really limits how much housing we can have throughout the city. It actually drives up the cost of housing, and it limits the types of housing you can have in different neighborhoods. So the proposal would revisit the city's land use framework and change the single family and the low density multifamily into two new missing middle housing land use designations, which I will show you in just a moment here. Really quick, what is missing middle housing? It's a term many people have heard. It refers to this mid-scale range of housing types, something that's smaller or more close together than a single family detached house is. Smaller than single family houses, but also not at the scale of large buildings, such as you see on the right. So it's duplexes, triplexes, on up to small multifamily. And these are housing types that exist around the city, around cities around the country. But in the 50s and beyond, cities decided that single family was the way to go and really set aside most of our housing land for single family. And today we're built out and a lot has changed. Our incomes have not kept up. Single family housing is too expensive for many people to afford. So the proposals would look at missing middle, allowing missing middle more broadly, but we heard loud and clear that design is extremely important and getting design right is very important. So the proposals would adopt missing middle design principles. And you can see them written here. I know that words don't always convey it, but we also have pictures to go with them. But missing middle should be in a walkable context, and it should be strongly pedestrian oriented. Consistent massing and scale, so not bigger and bulkier than the buildings around it, and compatible design language, so kind of orientation to the street and yards and street trees, things like that. That there should be smooth transitions from lower to higher scales instead of abrupt changes. That the appearance of density should be reduced by breaking up the mass and size of buildings. That we should strive to build a strong sense of community by integrating shared spaces, particularly in something like a cottage housing development, which has a shared common space. That cars should be tucked away as much as possible, kind of towards the back of the site. And that we really want to maintain a sense of continuity and encourage the reuse of existing structures. That might mean a house today could be converted into 2-family or 3-family or some other type. So those are the design principles. As you comment on these proposals, we'd love to get your input if we got those design principles right, and if this is the way that the city should guide infill of missing middle housing. So I mentioned that we would be creating 2 new land use designations. First is the low density residential. And as you see in the graphic here, you can have a structure that's about the size and about the shape of a house, but within that building envelope, you could have 2, 3, or more people or households living there. So that is the basic idea, that existing houses could be converted or new structures could be built, but they would basically be the size and bulk of a single-family house. The second new land use designation is the mid-scale residential. So this is the kind of the upper end of this missing middle continuum, but it actually is intended to serve as a transition. Right now, we have many areas where we have tall buildings allowed, and then right across the street, or even across a property line, you have single-family houses. That is a concern for a lot of people, and this proposal would try to address that by creating a mid-scale transition area, and those would actually be located in close walking distance to shopping, transit, and other things, and so create more affordable housing and more urban living supply than we have today. So those are the 2 proposed new land use designations, low-scale residential, mid-scale residential. So the Planning Commission looked at our current city and our current residential areas, and they have proposed to redesignate those areas as low or mid-scale residential, and they made a determination about which is appropriate based on how close the area was to shopping, transit, and important corridors. And so the map on the right here shows centers, designated corridors, which are streets usually connecting important destinations and with transit service on them. And then also the green line here shows bus routes throughout the city. So those would be the areas where we would be locating this kind of mid-scale of housing. And the commission has put together 2 housing growth scenarios. One is called Evolve Housing Choices. The other is called Transform Housing Choices. And they're too tiny to see on the screen. So this is just to give you a quick visual. When you go to the project webpage, you'll be able to zoom in and look closely on particular areas of the city and see what's proposed. But both of these are pretty significant changes, because the light yellow color, those are areas that would be designated as low-scale residential, meaning house size, but you could have more than 1 unit per structure. So that's already a significant change. The pink areas would be areas where you could have a mid-scale of multifamily development take place. Both would come with design standards, and the difference between the 2 is how much low and how much mid-scale is proposed. So I really encourage everybody after this call or during the call, during the meeting, to go online to homeintacoma.org and cityoftacoma/home in Tacoma. and click on this housing growth scenarios map. And you can see that people are starting to put comments on the map. So I encourage you to do that. You can zoom in and see what's proposed under scenario 1 and scenario 2. And I took just an image here of a neighborhood. And so within this light pink area, you'd be able to build a small apartment building. And then in the light yellow area, it would be the lower scale of missing middle housing types. So definitely check out and comment on that housing growth scenarios map. People really want to know, okay, if we make all these changes to housing rules, does that mean the city is going to change overnight? That's definitely not the case. Change will not happen overnight because the city can be super flexible and allow all kinds of housing to be built. And in fact, we do in many areas of the city. And growth only happens so fast, and it's based on the market demand and other considerations. So these changes would certainly be likely to spur how much growth would happen. But the bigger change is that they would probably change the kind of housing growth that happened. So instead of, in recent years, we've seen mostly multifamily in our centers, we would expect that we would see more of a range of different housing costs and housing types, from small multifamily on up to townhouses and other missing middle housing types. And that's actually part of the idea, because having that diverse range of housing types, that means a diverse range of housing costs. It also means more choice throughout the neighborhoods of the city. So no matter what the city does, we can encourage housing developers to build all kinds of housing. That will help, but it's not going to address the housing need that Jacques described at the beginning. We know that there are many Tacoma residents who would still struggle to access housing. So the proposals also say, let's strengthen the city's affordable housing regulatory tools. What those are is the city can exchange a bonus, whether it's some additional building height, a streamlined permit process, or other bonuses that have value to a developer. In exchange, that developer would include some affordable units in their building. There are lots of different ways that that could be structured, but at this phase of the project, if council says yes to these proposals, we would be moving into a phase of really developing the different options and expanding those affordable housing tools. The nuts and bolts here, I'm almost done with my presentation. I hope I haven't gone too long and lost all of you. There are many different documents that you'll see on the project webpage. The Housing Action Plan is where you'll go if you really want to see the market analysis and some of the long-term recommendations. The actual changes that are proposed right now, those are the comp plan policy changes. And they're in 3 different chapters of our comprehensive plan, the city's blueprint for growth. Those are the actual changes that would be adopted now. There are also some near-term code changes, which I certainly encourage you to look at. They're all consistent with the city's existing policies or state legislative requirements, still significant. The SEPA determination is looking at the different environmental infrastructure potential impacts and how we need to handle those. So that is what is in the package. I'm not sure if I said this clearly at the top, but we were at this policy phase. So if council adopts the proposals in a form similar to where they are now, they would be essentially saying, this is the direction that the city will be going. We will be expanding housing choices and having more missing middle housing. And then the second phase, that would be when we need to work out the zoning, the standards, the affordable housing tools, many, many details, the infrastructure. And so that phase is scheduled right now for July to December. And sign up now, even if you participate now or if people miss this current phase, that second phase is very important, and there's lots of input that we need from you at that phase as well. So I am done with my presentation. I'll leave this slide here and stop talking and start listening. Kenny, are you queued up to share some questions from our participants?
I am just about ready. Will you read those dates for people while I'm getting us our first question? And for
For sure.
everybody else, we'd love to start getting your questions. You can submit a question by pressing the Q&A button and writing it in. Those will all go to me, and I'm going to start reading them to both Elliot and Jacques. And just so you know, we're using this a little differently. You might see a column that says answered. The way I'm using that is I'm putting the questions that we're not able to get to during this portion, but my colleague Larry is in there, and if he can, he will write you written answers to those questions in there. So you can look for those in there. And otherwise, let me find what question we are going to ask first. I'm going to focus on the ones that I just got. And then I think, Elliot, I might have you stop sharing your screen so people can just see you too. All right. So this first question is from Debbie. And I think I'm going to go back and forth between Elliot and Jacques. If one of you thinks the other has a little more expertise on the subject, please just pass it to each other. So Elliot, your first one is, can you please share, oh, this is from Debbie. Can you please share highlights of the code changes planned for ADUs? And whenever I use an acronym, will you define it for us?
My pleasure. Yeah, so ADU stands for accessory dwelling unit. And that just means a second smaller housing unit located on the same parcel, usually with a house. So the proposals would modify some changes the council has already made back in 2019. Council allowed ADUs citywide throughout our neighborhoods. Since then, there have been about 200 applications in for people to build an ADU. So there's a lot of interest there. And the changes that we are proposing here really are just, when we rolled that code out, people were confused by certain things, or certain requirements were just didn't seem to be really serving a purpose. So the code changes that we have in there are really cleanups to implement the city's decision to allow ADUs more widely.
Cool. And I'm actually going to do some follow-up since I have a few more about ADU for you, Elliot.
Sure.
This next one is, why is the detached ADU height limit capped at 15 feet and or the height of an existing structure? And that's from Mitchell.
Right. Well, actually, there are some changes there in these near-term code changes. So the idea of an accessory dwelling unit was that it should be smaller than the main house. And therefore, it's going to be smaller, it can't be taller than the main house is the idea there. And so we are looking at adding some more flexibility, and sometimes you have a front house which is just not that tall. And so having a slightly taller accessory dwelling unit might be fine. So that's the kind of change that's proposed in this package right now.
Okay, I'll have one more follow-up from Mitchell. Mitchell asks, what is Tacoma Power doing to be a partner in increasing housing? I was looking at doing a detached ADU, but Tacoma Power told me I'd have to pay for a replacement street transformer and it would cost $10,000. How does this help make housing affordable?
Yeah, great question. So Tacoma Public Utilities is right there with us in trying to think about how to address the cost of housing. But the current situation is that we've been building mostly single family houses for a long time, at least in most neighborhoods of the city. And so all of our city departments are making some adjustments and looking back at the standards in place right now and figuring out, are there some things that we don't necessarily need to require in every case, but we also don't want to go too far because we're still responsible to make sure that the power turns on and the building is safe, et cetera. So I can tell you that TPU and our other infrastructure partners are behind the scenes informing these proposals and trying to look for ways to bring the cost down where we can do that.
Cool, thank you. And just so the audience knows my philosophy, the other reason I'm using that answered tab is so you can have full transparency in terms of what questions we're asking and not asking. If you think I skipped one of the hard questions, let me know. I'm gonna try to give Elliot and Jacques some softballs and some hardballs. So we're gonna do the whole gamut. Jacques, sorry, your first one is a big one. Let me know if you need me to repeat any of it. It's a great question from Haley, but it has a lot of components. So Haley says, interesting you mentioned racism because the majority of your rezoning efforts are targeted at lower income communities. How do you address systematic racism practices that are ongoing that your proposal takes advantage of, such as view sensitive overlay, which is view protection for North and Northeast Tacoma, but not Central and East Tacoma, or removing homeowners from low-income communities due to apartment complexes, and therefore removing one way to invest and build equity through home ownership? That was a lot, but did you get that?
I did get that, and that is quite the question. It's a great question. I think I would say the way that this proposal gets to equity is that it does not focus only on those lower opportunity areas. In fact, it changes the single family designation in North Tacoma, in Northeast Tacoma, in Old Town, in places where we've had historically some of our strongest barriers to access to housing opportunity. And so I think that's point number one. Number two is I think when you think about why some of the neighborhoods like the East Side and South Tacoma have been underinvested in historically, these proposals can actually do something to help us address that historical wrong. And so if you think about why some of the business districts and some of the hearts of the neighborhoods that we love in Tacoma aren't as strong as they could be, it's because we don't have the density that we need to support thriving businesses at the rate that we need to. And one of the ways that we can help do that is by creating affordable housing choices at different income levels and different price points that are within proximity to those centers and nearby corridors, right? So I do think that the proposals, if you dive into some of the specifics, it does a couple of things in terms of increasing housing choice and opportunity in some of our higher opportunity areas, but also as a strategy to help develop opportunity in our lower opportunity areas. And then the last thing I would say is with any change and growth comes risk. And so as we talk about things like displacement and what happens to long-term homeowners, I was really moved by the term gentle density when I learned about it, because I think it helps explain to me what a lot of this change looks and feels like in real life. So if you think about our main transportation corridors, those are the places that you typically already see a lot of our development and a lot of our mid-scale type of development. And you would continue to see that under this scenario with that setback a little bit further, right? Like a block further in one scenario and a quarter of a mile in another scenario. Elliot, jump in if I'm getting the numbers wrong there. But the opportunity that we build when we start thinking about all of those dense areas that we can create throughout the city that can create economic opportunity as well as housing opportunity. I think that presents a big opportunity also because we talk about lowering the price point in those neighborhoods for people to stay in those neighborhoods, for younger people to get into those neighborhoods that they may have grown up in and want to buy a home in, and also economic opportunities for people to think about how they could potentially use an ADU to house a family member or to create rental income for themselves, or a lot of different things that people haven't had the opportunity to because of our policies as a city.
Thanks for answering such a big question, Jacques. Elliot, to get you back, I'll make you have to solve racism in the next question. So get ready for that.
No problem.
But before that, how about this question from Michael, Elliot? Michael says, in one of the documents on the planning department's website, you acknowledge that for most ordinary residents, their wealth, which is a word the office uses, is in their home, and they use it for a healthy retirement. Like many in the Proctor district, we are retired and on a fixed income. How is the city committing to ensuring that our property value, which we will rely on for secure retirement, does not diminish with the potential of a 4-story apartment going in next door, given the new buffer zone you're planning?
Yeah, that's a really common concern that people have because, you know, myself, most of us, you know, aspire to have a home as an investment as much as our shelter. And so, to answer that concern, we have done a lot of study, you know, and looked at other communities uh, where you do see a mix of different housing types together, and even looked at some communities where, you know, they've been recently introducing these kind of more flexible zoning approaches. And you know, generally speaking, the property values would only go up. Property values are continuing to, or are going up right now anyway. And in fact, that can even be a challenge for folks as property taxes increase. So, you know, the idea of getting good design built into this is that we would not be harming anyone. We want to be very careful that we don't put something that would harm a neighborhood or really be a negative impact to an adjacent property. Now, I do know that it's a huge change to think about in an area that has been single family for a very long time. But I guess I would just encourage people to think about other neighborhoods of the city or other cities where you see a mix of different housing types together and it's a thriving neighborhood. So
Can you give me an example, Elliot, of somewhere in Tacoma that it's more
sure.
common?
Well, really any neighborhood that was built before zoning, as a planner, I should be, you know, pro zoning, but in the 50s, zoning came along and outlawed missing middle housing in most of our residential areas. So a neighborhood that's older than that, and the most obvious example for many people is the North Slope. But if you look along 6th Avenue, the Lincoln District, you know, lots of our older neighborhoods, you'll see it's a traditional neighborhood pattern that that cities decided was no longer desirable in the 50s, and now people are coming back to because they have a lot of benefits.
Thank you. All right, Jacques. This question from Richard. Would this proposal allow someone to buy a single family home in an existing neighborhood, tear it down, and build a duplex in its place?
Yeah, great question. The simple answer is yes. The complicated answer is only if they meet a series of the requirements in terms of setback and design review and standards, right? So there aren't. I would also say that the reality of that happening is probably more the exception than the rule, just because the prices of land and housing doesn't make it pencil out for people to purchase what is habitable properties and tear them down into duplexes for the most part. But I think in broad brushstrokes, yes, wherever there's a single family house under these proposals, you would be allowed to have a duplex on that site if it were to meet design review standards.
Thanks.
Elliot, is that?
That's right, but I wanted to just add something to what Jacques just said. So the policies, as they're written right now, they do allow infill of these different housing types, or they would allow that if council adopts them. But there's also a lot of work that we know we need to do, because the policies also say that we do not want to spur demolitions of viable homes, particularly historic structures and historic districts. You know, that's not the objective. And there are ways that other cities have written their standards to try to at least encourage the reuse of buildings rather than demolitions. So those are, you know, serious concerns, and you know, one of the downsides for many people is the idea of demolitions taking place. But these proposals try to strike that balance with the upsides of creating more housing choices and more housing supply.
Thanks, Elliot. Your next question is from Joseph. How wide or deep are these transportation corridors? And remind people what that means. And how many blocks from a bus line?
Sure. Well, we have the corridors that we have actually come from our land use framework, and they're not a particular set distance or distribution. They're designated because they're important streets that usually connect at least two different centers. And sometimes they connect, multiple important destinations. And so that corridor's destination or designation means that basically they're just an important connection across the city. They usually have transit on them, but there are other streets that also have transit service. And so that's why the Planning Commission integrated bus routes in addition to those designated corridors. Does that answer the question? Or
Yes.
was this more about the distance?
I think the distance was the question, yeah. If you can shed any.
Okay. Yeah, so the distance from the corridors varies in the two scenarios. So the scenario one, called Evolve Housing Choices, that has, I think it's 150-foot distance from the center of a street of one of those corridors, and actually does not include bus lines. And then in scenario two, the distance is further. I believe it's 1/8 of a mile from those corridors, and also adding bus lines to it. So that's one of the reasons why there's a lot more mid-scale in scenario two, the transformed housing choices. So hopefully that answers the question. There's some specific numbers. If you look, in our staff report, you can see the specific buffer distances that the commission went with those two scenarios.
Thanks, Elliot. And just so everyone knows, we're definitely getting more questions than we're going to be able to get to today. But Elliot's team, which might just be Elliot, Elliot's team is going to work on creating a document of frequently asked questions that'll get you all your answers. So Jacques might help with that. I don't know. We'll see. So we're going to try to get answers to all of your questions, and we'll post the recording of this event and the frequently asked questions to the Home in Tacoma website, which is in the chat. So Jacques, here is your next question. John says, in South Tacoma, we have so much growth capacity already with our huge mixed use centers. Why would we need more density in single household areas anytime soon?
The short answer is you're right, and we need both. I think Tacoma is in a period of growth right now where we see our population is growing. It's getting more diverse in terms of age, in terms of income levels, in terms of lifestyles. And all of that just means that we need to think about our housing choices differently. It's not that we have a city of people that are in families with a husband, a wife, 2 kids, and a dog. They're all different kinds of housing needs in terms of what that looks like. And we're not going to accomplish that, all of the diverse housing needs that we need. We're not going to get those just in mixed use centers. So that's the one side of the coin of needing to diversify our housing choices throughout South Tacoma and other neighborhoods. But then you're also right, we need to think about ways to really make those mixed use centers work to the best of their abilities. And I think those two things can be one and the same, because as we think about how do we create more housing opportunities close to those mixed use centers and in those mixed use centers, that's when you start to see more businesses locate there, more stores locate there. And from a city services perspective, when you have more people in the same neighborhood, it makes it easier for us as a city to provide services that are really accessible to more people, including in South Tacoma, where we know that's been an issue historically. So that's why I bring that up.
Thanks, Jacques. All right, next question is from Jody for Elliot. If areas are rezoned for mid-scale, will property owners still be able to choose low scale, i.e. cottage or townhouses, or will only 3 to 4 apartment buildings, 3 to 4 floor apartment buildings be allowed?
Good question, Jody. The proposals as written would allow the full range. There's no minimum density built in there to the current proposals, so you could still build even a house on up to cottages or some of the other low-scale housing types in those mid-scale areas. But could I just make one quick clarification, Kenny? I just wanted to, Jacques and I, we've been working on these proposals, we're proponents to some extent, but our job tonight is really just to give you the information, give you the rationale behind these proposals, but then we welcome all kinds of input, whether it's, you hate the whole thing, or we're not doing enough, or anything in between. The purpose of this is to try to collaborate with the community. These are big proposals, significant change, and it cannot be done well without getting your feedback. And so that's our purpose tonight. Even though you'll hear us saying, the policy rationale, every kind of input is absolutely encouraged.
Thank you. Looking for our next question. Jacques, this is from Jane. I certainly support the development of affordable housing, but to me, there is an element of maintaining status quo in that mindset. How does the city incorporate strategies that work to add more people owning homes and begin to generate wealth for themselves and their families?
That's a great question. And our hope is that the Home in Tacoma changes would do exactly that. So if you think about that rise in home prices that I showed you in the slide, you saw that they've increased by 44% over the past several years, and incomes haven't risen. You also see a wealth distribution that's increasingly having our older residents holding a larger percentage of the wealth in the community. And so what that translates to in terms of housing opportunity is that bar for people to get into home ownership keeps getting higher and higher and harder for people to get over. And so as we think about what are the things that we could do to make home ownership more attainable for more people, there's two sides of the coin. One of them is, you could make sure that people have more money, right? If everybody just got a job that paid them six figures, then, more people would be able to afford housing. Sure, but that's not realistic considering what our economic outlook is right now. So on the other side of it, it's that you need to create more homes that are at different price points. And because of that, the fact that such a large percentage of our city right now is designated as only being able to have this one type of housing, which is single family, when you think about what it costs to create one single family home, right? There's the cost of the land, there's the cost of the construction, there's the cost that all of the costs that you that are on the line that are in the development world know better than me, but it's not cheap. And because of that, it's really, really hard to build a single family home that is affordable and accessible to a larger number of people. So when you change that dynamic and you say, instead of just a single family home here, you can build 3 units, one of which is an ADU, or you can build a duplex so that you can get 2 properties on one piece of land, you start cutting away at the costs of producing that, right? So a duplex costs half as much in terms of land, and it doesn't cost the full amount that it would for 2 single family homes. So by creating these policy opportunities for developers to cut their costs and create smaller units at different price points, we're hoping that in conjunction with other affordability incentives that Elliot may talk more about moving forward, would give more people the opportunity to actually get into the home ownership game in the first place.
Thanks, Jacques. This is actually a great follow-up question to that for Elliot. This is from Joel. Are any efforts being made to have these plans account for historically biased housing plans? That is, will neighborhoods that have benefited from past policies have different changes than neighborhoods that have been hurt by past policies?
Well, good question. Short answer is no, we're not, there's nothing in these proposals that sort of treat neighborhoods differently in terms of the types of growth that would be allowed or encouraged. Instead, the focus is really on, I guess, evening the playing field and creating more opportunity throughout the city, and knowing that's going to benefit people in high cost neighborhoods as well as people in low cost neighborhoods. So I would say that's probably a big underlying principle there, is to benefit everybody. There are policies in here that call for help to kind of help people who have been harmed by systemic racism over decades past, to help support people of color or people who are maybe facing other kinds of, barriers or economic disadvantages to try to get into home ownership. And also to combat displacement. So if a neighborhood is affordable today and the city's growing, it's getting more and more expensive and people are getting forced to move somewhere else. Well, there are some things the city can try to do to help people to stay in that neighborhood. One is just creating a range of housing types in that neighborhood, but there are some more targeted things the city can do as well, like work with developers to market to the people who are there today, which does not always happen, and things like that. So much of what we're talking about here has to do with kind of land use. There are all sorts of other programs and policies that the city can try to do to help people to overcome the impacts of systemic racism.
Thanks, Elliot. All right, Jacques, now I'm going to really make you work. I'm going to give you 3 different questions all at once, but because they're all about incentives. So these are from Angela, Russ, and Russell. So what are some examples of benefits that developers could receive when providing affordable housing? What are benefits that homeowners for converting existing viable structures? And then can just elaborating on encouraging affordable housing. I think just all 3 people just kind of want an overview of incentives.
Sure. And Elliot, I'll ask for your help to back me up on this. There's actually a whole toolbox full of incentives that we can use in different situations to try to encourage different things. And so when we talk about, I'll start with our mixed use centers. And when we talk about how tall those buildings are, there are often incentives like 1 extra floor that you would be able to build if you included a certain number of units that were affordable. Many of you may know the multifamily tax exemption and the tax credit that developers are given if they set aside a certain number of the units in their development for certain affordability standards. And then there are other incentives in terms of fund stacking and public dollars from the city's housing funds. So LISC funds, HUD funds, CDBG funds, those are all funds that can be leveraged in certain situations for different developments. So that's on the development side. And then incentives on the more on the homeowner side and the individual side. There are models of how to do that, like creating revolving loan funds or small grant funds to help people build ADUs, or to create land banks where people will have affordability built into those ADUs. And I would say we're exploring all of those. And if you have guidance or feedback about which incentives you think would work best for you or your community, we would love to hear that, because everything is on the table for how we can really get to our goals together with whatever those incentives might need to be. Elliot, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you covered almost everything I would have said. I just think that the basic concept is to offer something of value to a developer, such as the ability to build a bigger building, for example, and in exchange, some of that extra profit that a developer could earn for building a bigger building would go back and become some affordable housing inside that building. That's one model. There are lots of different models for it. And then the other piece, which I appreciate Jacques mentioning, we also want to do a lot of education and training, especially for homeowners who are not professionals, but might be interested in doing something like an accessory unit. And so that's part of the program as well, to try to support folks with education and technical support.
Thank you, Elliot. This next one's for you. And just so folks know, we have about 25 more minutes. We're going to get to as many questions as we can. This is from Michael. Can a developer purchase 2 to 3 adjacent properties, tear them down, and build a large building? Would the city allow that?
Great question. So I'm guessing you're probably thinking of that proposed mid-scale land use category. And so the short answer is that's not really the vision here. The vision says that we would be looking for a scale of building that is not as massive as you would see in downtown or the Proctor, where you would have a whole block of structure. So instead, it would be perhaps as wide as one house or 2 houses along the street, and the walls along the sides would be limited, so they couldn't be just a solid wall right on the property line. So there would still be some space, some separation, and some scale control in those areas. The details have not yet been written because right now it's a conversation about the vision and the basic policy framework. So stay tuned. If council moves forward with this proposal, we will need to hear from everybody about the specifics of how to make that work.
Thank you. Jacques, you're actually typing an answer to the question I was going to ask you. So this is from Adam. How is affordability being defined? Aren't current standards based off of area median income, therefore making affordable units actually unaffordable, but still delivering incentives to developers?
Great question. It really goes down to what your definition of affordable is. And so you are correct that when we talk about affordability in programs like the multifamily tax exemption, that affordability is tied to the area median income. And it's generally hardest to get to the deepest levels of affordability. So when you're talking about somebody that is making that is on a fixed income, or somebody that's making $30,000 a year, you're absolutely right that it's not going to be easy to find a housing opportunity that works for you for 30% of your income, which is going to come out to something like $600 a month. And how difficult would it be to find a unit for $600 a month that works for a family that's on a $30,000 a year? So the premise of your question is absolutely right, that affordability has to be looked at with a microscope when we say that, because if we want to be cognizant of affordability at the deepest levels, a lot of these tools aren't going to get us there. So I'll say that tools like the multifamily tax exemption, that incentive, that really only works best at getting to 80% of AMI, which isn't affordable when you're talking about somebody that's making $30,000 a year or even more. So that's a good point to raise. But the other thing I would say is we also have to recognize that we are in a supply and demand crunch, and that our lack of supply of housing is one of the reasons why demand is so high and is pushing prices as high as they are. And so even if you're not creating a quote unquote truly affordable unit of housing, you are creating a piece of the solution by putting another housing unit into play, if that makes sense. So when we talk about affordable units, it is across that whole spectrum. And when we talk about housing attainability, as we are in the Home in Tacoma project, it is about really increasing supply and choice across all income levels.
Thanks, Jacques. Elliot, your next question is from James and Georgette. When you make plans to build new apartments within each neighborhood, such as Proctor, how does the Planning Commission plan to preserve and protect the older buildings in each neighborhood that make them unique? In the process of tearing down older buildings, the soul of a neighborhood can be destroyed and each neighborhood ends up looking alike.
Yeah, I really understand the spirit of that question. And, I think about that in a couple of ways. I mean, first, I just think it's important to recognize that change is hard because people really care about and love our neighborhoods. And so there are certain things that the city can try to do to prevent undesired impacts, like the loss of important structures. So you mentioned the Proctor District. There are several buildings within the district that have been designated as historic structures, so they have protection, and that's a process that can be used. We can also try to craft our standards to give a boost, to encourage the reuse of existing structures rather than demolitions. That is in the proposals that we want to try to encourage that, at least, and require it for really significant historic structures. And I guess I think that philosophically, neighborhoods always change and have changed over time. And so I will be the first to say that change is going to come with positives and negatives, depending on your perspective. But the current reality is one where many people are being left out of the equation who would like to be able to live in a particular neighborhood. And so that's the positive that we're trying to work on. And the negative that we're trying to prevent is the loss of the qualities that people really care about. So I hope that's a bit of a philosophical answer, but this is also what the Planning Commission is asking from you, how to strike that balance through these proposals.
Thanks, Elliot. Jacques, two questions from Ellen. How will property values of current single-family home properties be affected by mid-scale housing that is directly adjacent to homes? Then, is there a plan to compensate homeowners for loss of privacy or loss of light cast by shadows of four-story buildings?
During that question.
I'm sorry?
You cut out and I wasn't able to hear that question.
Okay, so the second question is there a plan to compensate homeowners for loss of privacy or loss of light cast by shadows?
Okay,
I think my internet is down. Just a second.
Okay. I just got a little snippet of that.
Shoot. Hey, can y'all hear me now?
Talk about that for a second, Elliot.
Sure.
And assume that is the question until Kenny gets back on.
And it's a common question, people want that's massive and that casts a shadow over a small structure next to it. So the proposal here is to try to create this single family area or block that's right single family homes would be replaced or converted into a higher density. So there's a lot of sensitivity to that idea of a transition, and in fact we are thinking of this as, in a way, improving upon the historically designated structures. That is something that we have to think through very carefully. And we are consulting with the Landmarks Preservation Commission and the city's historic preservation staff on how to do that. There are standards in place that even if we allow a small multi-family project to get built, would protect the structures that are there in a historic district. But we're dialoguing with the experts because we don't want to increase the pressure to demolish important historic structures. So it is a tension. It's something that we want to recognize and work through to strike the right balance. And yeah,
Hey,
Larry, thanks for,
everybody.
oh, there he is.
All right, sorry about that. I'm losing internet at my house. Welcome to 2021 pandemic internet Zoom life. So Ellen's follow-up question was, and if you already answered it, just let me know. It was, is there a plan to compensate homeowners for loss of privacy or loss of light cast by shadows of 4-story buildings adjacent to single-family homes?
Okay, I'll take that one. I mean, the short answer is no, but the thinking behind that is that we are trying to craft a proposal that will benefit everyone. We know that not everyone will be happy with it, but we hope to put together standards that will make sure that buildings are attractive, that fit the scale of the neighborhood, and that generally bring up property values. So we hope to avoid that problem, and we are doing our very best to do so. We do know, I mean, I just want to be completely honest with folks. We know not everybody's going to be happy with these proposals, and it is a lot of change. And I think underlying this is an idea that we are a city and that we do need to kind of continue to grow over time. And currently, our housing rules, in part, are standing in the way of doing that.
Thanks, Elliot. Jacques, your next question. Oh, actually, I think whoever wants to answer this can answer this one. This is from Sasha. Sasha asks if Tacoma has considered a vacancy tax, and I don't know what that is, so if you do, please define. In my neighborhood in the North End, there are many vacant homes, so are we considering a vacancy tax? And Sasha also says, in future presentations, please talk about the racist roots of single-family zoning. So, Elliot, is that a question for you?
Oh,
I'll take it.
You got it,
thank you,
Jacques?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll take that. No, the council hasn't considered that right now. That hasn't been one of the tools that they've talked about putting into play. That doesn't mean that it's ever been talked about and said, no, we couldn't do that. I just don't think that that's a tool that they've talked about, Elliot, unless you've heard something that I haven't. So with that being said, yeah, I think it's a great point, and thank you for pointing out that single family zoning was part of a system of restrictive housing laws that created what we see in terms of racial segregation of housing. And that included single family zoning, highway development where it was, racially restrictive covenants, and federally backed racially influenced redlining, residential redlining. So all of that happened between the 30s and the 50s, and had a really, really significant impact on the racial demographics of our neighborhoods and the housing opportunity that came with that.
Thanks, Jacques. We have maybe time for 2 or 3 more questions. I'm picking Austin next because Austin's last name is almost the same as mine. So if you want priorities, change your name really quick, I guess. This is from Austin. One aspect of a livable city is a connection to nature. How can the city's existing tree canopy and green space be considered and preserved in the new plan, particularly in areas with new construction? And how can the plan include considerations for expanding canopy coverage and access to green space?
Oh yeah, I'd love to take that question. That's something that we are looking at very closely. The basic idea that we would be allowing more structures to be built, or perhaps, spurring development. That might mean trees getting cut down, perhaps yards, having a structure in them. And so there's a loss of open space and canopy cover that could come from this. So how do we prevent that or compensate for it? We also have strong policies in our comprehensive plan to try and expand our canopy cover, and particularly to do so in lower income neighborhoods where there are not as many trees. So some of the things we can do is we have landscaping standards. This proposal could move forward with requirements to plant street trees, which is currently not the case when someone builds a single family house. There could be other types of requirements built in to leave yard space undeveloped. And so those are some of the answers, but also we're reaching out to our urban forest program and our open space program folks, as well as metro parks, and looking at a neighborhood scale, because sometimes if you live in especially a denser neighborhood, maybe it's not on your property, but it's nearby that you go and access green space. Those are all extremely important. And while this proposal focuses on the housing side, we're trying to coordinate with those folks to make sure that urban forestry goals rise along with housing goals here. But again, as I just want to reiterate, weigh in. Do you feel that this is the right balance, or how can we do better?
Thanks, Elliot. Jacques, I don't know if this question's for you, but do what you got to do. This is from Smith. Will you have permit-ready plans for ADUs, duplexes, triplexes, etc., that would be in line with your ideas for design, etc.? This would create an equitable opportunity for all to improve and be part of the evolution or transformative plans.
Yes, I believe we will.
Yes, absolutely.
Is that easy?
That's part of the proposals. In fact, before we lost our urban design expert, moved to a different city. That was on his work program for 2021 to develop ADU design guidance or pre-approved plans. And so with that as one of our near-term actions that we would like to bring forward. And that could then expand to other housing types to try and make it that much easier, and also to try to give a boost to the quality and the design of those projects.
All right, I just want to prove I have psychic powers, because this was the next question I was going to pick, and Jacques asked me to pick it. So we're thinking alike. I'll have, you both can talk about it if you like, but Elliot, you can start. This is from Northwest ABA Tacoma. There's construction of a multifamily unit in my neighborhood. They have not provided for appropriate parking for all the units being built. My concern is, with more and more of these units going in, what is the long-term plan for increased traffic and parking needs?
Yeah, parking is another of the top concerns that people have. It's traffic and parking, and I guess I would say that that is another point of tension. When more space is used for housing, less space is available for on-site parking, and so so that is something that the proposal, we don't directly affect parking through this, but we do call for a review of our parking standards to make sure that that some parking is being provided throughout the city, particularly for people who might need it for accessibility reasons or for deliveries and things like that. Some basic functionality should be available everywhere, but then the term that we use is to right-size the parking standards, and reflecting that parking is going to get a little bit more scarce as neighborhoods grow, but still providing some parking where it's really needed, and then trying to make neighborhoods walkable, transit supportive, etc. And so I know that there's growing pains in the in-between period when new developments coming in and some parking management tools may not have been deployed yet. So recognize it's a tricky issue.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, Elliot, I think philosophically, we're a city and we're not a suburb, and I think that's one of the tension points that Elliot's talking about, is that we don't necessarily have the space that a suburb does to continue to grow outwardly in terms of being able to continually provide single family homes and parking spaces for 2 or 3 cars per house. And then when you think about how we're developing, there's a reason why the mid-scale development is happening around what we're calling transit corridors, right? Because there's intentionality around this strategy of making sure that our city is one that you can live in and you can still access the things that you would need every day in a convenient way without necessarily needing a car. And the tension that Elliot's talking about is that right now we don't have all of those transportation opportunities that we might need for that to work. But that's because the transit opportunities say that there aren't enough people there, right? So it's this circular thing where if you create the density along the transit corridors, the transit opportunities will improve, which will then make the transit corridors more convenient in terms of accessing everything. So the tension is that we are moving long term away from being an entirely car dependent city, and that has some tension in it. And we also want to make sure that development does take reasonable parking into account, and we do think about how to make sure we're not being naive about people using cars and needing to park, right? So that is a concern that, along with design and scale, we're taking into account, and would love to continue to hear from community about how to make work best in your community.
Thanks, Jacques. I told Jacques and Elliot I would let them leave at 7, so we're gonna finish up, but I want to leave you both time to have closing thoughts. Jacques, if you'll go first, and then Elliot. And I just want to remind our audience that we had about 50 questions we didn't get to. We are going to work on creating a document that gets answers to as many of those questions in kind of a frequently asked questions document. That and the recording of this event will be on the Home in Tacoma website. So we're going to try to get as many answers as possible. You can, of course, email Elliot and the team if you have follow-up questions. And yeah, so thank you so much, everybody. I'll pass it to Jacques to say goodbye, and then Elliot, if you can give us closing thoughts. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Kenny, and great job moderating tonight. My closing thought is just to reiterate that we are experiencing a housing crisis in the city right now, and we see it in a lot of different forms, whether it's rising home prices, rising rents, people increasingly falling into housing instability and homelessness, which we're seeing more and more. And because of that crisis, we need to think about all of the available tools that we have to address that housing crisis. And one of the really exciting tools that we have is zoning and development policy. And so I'm really excited about this conversation that the city is embarking on about what our housing growth philosophy is. And really grateful that Elliot and other city staff are doing such a fantastic job of thinking about and talking to people with all different kinds of concerns to make sure that, just like Elliot said, that this is really a value added for everybody in the city, even if it does have growing pains and tensions associated with it. But from a housing standpoint, I'm just really excited, and thank you for letting me be a part of this.
All right, well, my last thoughts, since Jacques really covered the affordable housing need, that side, which is extremely important. I mean, I will just talk about what makes a great neighborhood. You know, I would encourage everybody to, think about your own neighborhood today, other neighborhoods in the city, or maybe other cities that you visited, and think about some of the qualities that really make them great neighborhoods great urban neighborhoods. And for many of us, that has to do with the vibrancy and street life and opportunities that are within walking distance, a diversity of different building options, and all the interest that can come with that. And I would also ask people to consider why the city should restrict the types of housing in the way that we do today. Right now we are saying, no, there's only one option. And is there really a strong policy reason to continue to say that in light of the potential benefits that you might be able to have? And so I encourage you to think about that, as well as the affordability side, and then make your views known, share your perspectives, drop a pin on that map, email us, have your voice be heard as part of this very important process. And thank
Elliot,
you
can you remind us? Oh.
Yeah.
Can you remind us how to submit comments or when the public hearing is? And for those who don't know what a public hearing is, can you kind of explain it?
Absolutely. So the Planning Commission is looking for your input right now. They're going to use that input to finalize recommendations to the City Council. Council makes the final decisions. And the timeline here is on April 7th, which is a Wednesday, starting at 5:30. You can come to a Zoom meeting like this one and actually speak in person to the Planning Commission and speak your comments and what you think the Commission should recommend. But you can also write comments to planning@cityoftacoma.org. And you can write what you think the city should do in terms of these proposals. And then thirdly, you can go to that interactive map, the housing growth scenarios map. Thank you for posting the planning email there, Kenny. But the housing growth scenarios map is really interesting. You can zoom in on your house, your neighborhood, or the whole city, and you can actually drop a comment in and say whether you like scenario 1, 2, or neither, in a particular location, whether you think that there's something the city should be thinking about in specific locations around the city. So definitely use that mapping tool because it's a good way to think about these issues.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. We're glad you all came.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody.
Bye.